The haunting secret cemetery. Imagine walking through an old graveyard at midnight where the silence is so heavy it feels alive. Suddenly you hear it, a soft whisper, almost too quiet to notice. But then, it calls your name. You turn, heart pounding, but no one is there. The air feels colder, the gravestones seem closer, and you realize you're not alone. Before we dive into this terrifying tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our chilling stories. Now, let's step into the graveyard of unholy secrets. The night was a canvas of obsidian black, a darkness so complete it seemed as if the sky itself had swallowed every trace of light. Stars hid behind thick, rolling clouds, and the air carried a weight, a stillness that suffocated the life out of everything it touched. Blackwood Cemetery stretched endlessly across the hollowed-out land, a forgotten scar that locals whispered about in hushed tones, as though even speaking its name might summon something. The wrought iron gates, rusted and splintered, rose from the ground like jagged teeth, guarding the cemetery's sinister secrets. To those brave or foolish enough to wander through its boundaries, it felt less like a graveyard and more like the mouth of something ancient and alive, waiting to devour anyone who dared to cross its threshold. For Thomas, this was nothing but an opportunity to prove everyone wrong. The stories, the rumors, they were just that. Superstition, nonsense for people who lived their lives in fear. Ghosts don't exist. He'd scoffed earlier that evening, laughing as his friends tried to dissuade him. It's just some creepy old graveyard. What's the worst that could happen? But standing there now, under the looming arch of the cemetery gates, Thomas felt an unease he couldn't quite name. It was as if the land itself rejected him, like an intruder whose presence had upset a fragile, invisible balance. The silence was unnerving. Not the peaceful kind, but the type that makes your ears ring and your skin prickle, as though you're being watched from all sides by eyes that never blink. Thomas shook it off and stepped inside. The gravel path crunched beneath his boots, the sound echoing unnaturally through the still air. It was too loud, too intrusive. He shone his flashlight ahead, its weak beam cutting a narrow tunnel of light through the blackness. The graves flanked him on either side like sentinels, their worn headstones leaning at odd, broken angles. Some had collapsed entirely, as if whatever was buried beneath them had clawed its way out. Names and dates had been erased by time, leaving only empty epitaphs, blank slates that seemed to mock him as he passed. Thomas snorted softly to himself, trying to mask his discomfort. Creepy aesthetic, he muttered under his breath, as though hearing his own voice would anchor him to something normal. The flashlight flickered, and his pulse quickened. He tapped it against his palm, forcing it to stay on, though it seemed to protest its own existence in this place, as if even the light knew it didn't belong here. The farther he walked, the worse it got. The path was lined with weeds so thick and gnarled, they looked like skeletal fingers sprouting from the earth, reaching for his ankles. Above him, the twisted branches of old, dying trees created jagged shadows that shifted like black serpents in his peripheral vision. Thomas tried not to look at them, convinced they'd move even if he did. "It's just your imagination," he told himself over and over again, his breathing becoming more shallow. But the cemetery had a way of gnawing at your sanity, whispering doubts you couldn't shake. And then he saw it. Near the center of the graveyard, a tombstone stood apart from the others. It was taller, broader, and far darker, its surface slick as if the stone itself were wet. The beam of his flashlight seemed to slide off its surface, refusing to settle on its grotesque form. A chill ran through Thomas's body, stiffening his spine. The stone looked unnatural, not something a human would carve, but something that had always been. Its inscriptions weren't like the others. They weren't letters at all, but symbols, etched deeply, jaggedly, like scratches made by claws. They curled and intersected like a language not meant to be spoken aloud, shapes that felt wrong just to look at. Thomas blinked hard and tore his gaze away, a wave of nausea washing over him. At the base of the stone, something caught his eye, a small, dirt-streaked notebook. its leather cover cracked and fragile with age. "What the hell?" Thomas whispered, crouching down. His fingers hovered over the book, hesitating. He didn't want to touch it. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to leave it where it lay, and yet something pulled at him, as though invisible strings wrapped around his wrists and guided him forward. His hand met the book. The instant his fingertips brushed the cold leather, the ground beneath him shifted. At first it was subtle, like a vibration, a low hum he could feel in his bones. Then came the sound. A noise so deep and resonant it seemed to rise from the earth itself. A moan, long and drawn out, vibrating through the graves like a tuning fork struck by some unseen hand. Thomas stumbled backward, dropping the notebook as if it had burned him. His flashlight flickered violently, strobing in and out of existence. The shadows around him quivered, stretching impossibly long across the graves until they seemed to move. He whirled around, his chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice ragged, but there was no one, just the silence, suffocating and cruel. And yet, the sound persisted, a groan like something waking up beneath his feet. Thomas glanced down, and his breath caught in his throat. The soil at the base of the stone began to shift, bubbling as though it were boiling from within. Small cracks spiderwebbed across the earth, and the deep, guttural sound grew louder. It was coming from below. "Okay, nope, I'm out," Thomas muttered shakily, stumbling back toward the path. But his legs felt leaden, as though the ground itself was reluctant to release him. He took one last look at the dark tombstone, its inscrutable symbols now pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A breeze rolled through the cemetery, cold and rancid, like a breath expelled from the depths of a crypt. In it, Thomas thought he heard a whisper, low, faint, and undeniably human. "Help me." The sound was like a needle jabbed into his ear, sharp and sickening. He froze. He didn't want to turn around, but something inside him, the same thing that had brought him here, compelled him to look. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned back to face the stone. The notebook was open now. Its brittle pages flipped on their own, as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. And on its yellowed surface words appeared, scratched violently into the paper by an unseen hand. Thomas's heart pounded in his ears as he read the message, his eyes widening in terror. "Let us out." The flashlight flickered again, its pale, stuttering light carving sharp-edged slices through the oppressive blackness that surrounded Thomas like a smothering shroud. The beam wavered, faltering as though the battery had drained, even though it had been full when he left. With every sputter of the light, the gravestones seemed to shift, as if they were closing in, tilting slightly toward him like jagged teeth. Thomas felt it in his gut. Something in this graveyard hated the light, resented it. The realization sent cold needles of panic coursing through his veins. His eyes darted toward the tombstone again, the unnaturally tall, dark marker that seemed to throb in his periphery like a fresh bruise. The cursed notebook lay open at its base, its yellowed pages flapping with no breeze in sight. Thomas's mind screamed for him to leave it alone, but his legs disobeyed, inching closer despite the tremor in his knees. His throat felt tight, the air sour, metallic, as though he were breathing something that wasn't quite oxygen. Every breath made his lungs feel heavier, like they were filling with damp earth. The symbols etched into the tombstone were unlike anything he'd seen before, jagged, angular spirals that seemed alive. As his flashlight beam brushed over the engravings, the symbols shimmered, shifting ever so slightly like oil slicks in water. It wasn't just a trick of the light. Thomas knew it wasn't. There was something inherently wrong about that stone. It didn't look man-made, but rather born, as though it had sprouted from the ground, forged from something primordial and malevolent. The sound returned, low, guttural, a noise that made the marrow in his bones vibrate. It came not from a single direction, but everywhere at once, reverberating through the cemetery as though the earth itself was groaning. Thomas tried to steady his breathing, but his chest tightened painfully with each wheezing inhale. His flashlight caught movement at the edge of his vision, a rustling near one of the older graves. Slowly, instinctively, He turned the beam toward it. The grave was open. Not just open, but collapsed inward, as if whatever was buried there had violently clawed its way to the surface. The earth was disturbed in jagged chunks, and around the edges of the grave, tiny, finger-like roots curled upward like grasping hands. Thomas swallowed hard, his skin slick with sweat despite the cold, clammy air. The thought hit him with the force of a hammer. Something got out. But before he could even process the horror of what he was seeing, another grave let out a soft rumble. Then another. The sound spread outward, rippling across the cemetery like distant thunder. He could feel it beneath his boots, vibrations skittering up through his soles like skeletal fingers drumming against his bones. "No, no, no," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. The graves were moving, as if responding to his realization. The groaning sound stopped. Complete silence fell over the cemetery, thick and suffocating. Thomas froze, his blood pounding in his ears, louder than it had any right to be. Then came the sound that shattered him completely. Footsteps. Soft at first, gentle like someone walking barefoot on damp ground. They were close. Too close. Thomas spun on his heel, flashlight flailing wildly, its beam cutting uneven arcs through the mist that had begun to rise from the ground. There was nothing there, only the gravestones, standing sentinel in the dark. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, slow and deliberate, pacing around him. Thomas's mind raced, panic clenching at his chest like a fist. It felt as though something invisible was circling him, studying him. He could feel it, a weight, a presence, like he wasn't alone in his own skin. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The silence answered him. The flashlight dimmed again, flickering like a heartbeat, weak, erratic. A whisper cut through the quiet, close enough that it brushed his ear like a cold breath. "Help me." Thomas screamed and whipped around, his flashlight beam crashing into the darkness. He expected to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Just empty graves, shrouded in mist that was growing thicker by the second. He turned back toward the path, desperate to leave, but froze in place. The tombstone had changed. It now bore a name, a fresh carving where there had been only those inscrutable symbols moments before. And the name carved into the stone was his, Thomas Whitaker. Beneath it, the date of his death, tonight. The words slammed into him like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. His flashlight flickered violently and then died, plunging him into complete and utter darkness. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribcage as the whispers returned, louder now, hundreds of voices murmuring over each other. He clutched at his ears, trying to block out the sound, but the voices burrowed deeper, speaking in a language he couldn't understand but somehow knew. The ground beneath his feet shifted again. A brittle, crackling noise broke the silence, like bones snapping under pressure. Thomas staggered back, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. He could feel something moving beneath the soil, crawling toward him. His boots sank into the softening ground, as though the earth itself was hungry. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A figure rising from one of the disturbed graves. Slowly, jerkily it emerged, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head cocked at an impossible angle. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Thomas could feel its eyes, locked onto him with an intensity that burned. Its movements were unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. Thomas stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the frozen ground. He tried to scramble away, but his hands sank into the soil, too soft, like wet flesh. The figure tilted its head again, and then it smiled. Its mouth stretched too wide, teeth too sharp, a grin that split its face in two. It pointed at him, its bony finger trembling, and the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. In that agonizing stillness, Thomas could hear something just beneath him, scratching, clawing, digging. The earth split open beneath his hands, and from within the chasm something reached up. Fingers, thin, sharp, filthy, wrapped around his wrist, pulling him down into the freezing dark. Thomas screamed, a sound that tore through his throat and echoed across the cemetery, but no one was there to hear it. No one ever heard the screams from Blackwood Cemetery. Thomas's scream had barely left his throat when the ground beneath him gave way, splitting open with a sound like dry, brittle ribs cracking under pressure. It wasn't a natural collapse. The earth tore itself apart, as though unseen hands had pried it open just for him. Cold, damp soil surged up around his wrists, clinging to his skin like icy tar, pulling him downward with deliberate, unrelenting strength. Thomas kicked and flailed, his muscles burning with desperation as he tried to wrench himself free, but the more he fought, the deeper he sank. It felt as though the earth had become alive, hungry, and he was its next meal. He opened his mouth to scream again, but the air had changed. It was thick, heavy, filled with the coppery taste of rot. His lungs seized as though the atmosphere itself resisted his breath, a sensation like inhaling muddy water. Panic thundered through him, and for a fleeting moment his flashlight, forgotten and useless, flickered back to life where it lay half buried in the dirt, casting a pale glow across the rising mist. And then he saw them. Faces. They were faint at first, mere impressions in the swirling fog, but as the light steadied, they became clearer, horrifically detailed. Gaunt, skeletal visages floated just inches above the cracked earth, their hollow eye sockets locked onto him. Their mouths hung open in grotesque silent screams, jaws unhinged as though perpetually reliving their final agonizing breaths. Thomas's blood turned to ice as he realized the mist wasn't natural. It was coming from the graves. It rose in dense tendrils, seeping from cracks in the soil, carrying with it the faint smell of mildew and something far fouler. Death. One face, closer than the others, emerged fully from the gloom. Its sunken features were half-decayed, skin stretched tightly over exposed bone, yet its lips still moved, whispering something too faint to hear. Thomas felt his stomach twist as the figure hovered forward, its translucent form wavering like a reflection in rippling water. He could feel its gaze, emptied sockets still able to see him, pinning him in place like a specimen under glass. His arms trembled as he fought to push himself upright, his hands slipping in the damp, sinking earth. "What do you want?" he choked out, his voice cracked and hoarse. The whispers stopped. For one horrific beat, everything was still. The figures froze in the mist, suspended like marionettes, and the ground seemed to hold its breath. Then, as though a switch had been flipped, the voice returned, not a whisper anymore, but a chorus. Hundreds of overlapping voices shrieked in unison, piercing the silence with a sound so unnatural it felt like shards of glass burying themselves in his eardrums. The voices were not human. They rose in an unholy harmony, some screaming words he could almost understand, others letting out guttural noises that seemed older than language itself. Thomas clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating through his bones, shaking his very thoughts loose. He staggered back, his boots sinking deeper into the soil as if the earth itself was conspiring to drag him under. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt paralyzed, weighed down by invisible chains. And then, the faces began to move. One by one they rose from the mist, their ethereal forms solidifying as they clawed their way out of the darkness. Skeletal hands broke through the dirt, fingers twisted and sharp, pulling bodies, half-formed and grotesque, up from the depths of the graves. The air was filled with the sickening squelch of wet soil parting to make way for the dead. Some figures wore remnants of burial clothes, tattered and stained with the years they had spent rotting beneath the earth. Others were naked, their skin bloated and translucent, their veins dark and writhing like worms beneath the surface. One of them reached for him. Thomas recoiled, his heart hammering as a claw-like hand, thin and sinewy, its knuckles protruding like jagged rocks, closed around his ankle. The pressure was inhuman, like iron pincers digging into his flesh. "Get off me!" he screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip only tightened. His vision blurred as adrenaline surged through him, his mind spiraling into pure animal terror. He couldn't die here. Not like this. His hand fumbled in the dark until his fingers brushed against the flashlight. Without thinking, he swung it downward, the heavy metal casing connecting with the figure's hand with a sickening crunch. The thing released him, letting out a sound that wasn't quite a scream but something far worse, a distorted, inhuman cry that seemed to come from inside his head. Thomas scrambled to his feet, slipping and stumbling as he bolted toward the cemetery gate. The mist thickened behind him, tendrils curling and twisting like sentient limbs, chasing him with a slow, deliberate purpose. Every step felt like running through quicksand, his boots dragging against the heavy, sodden earth. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear them, those things, moving in the fog. Their footsteps were slow but relentless, an unnatural rhythm that echoed like drum beats in the distance. The gate came into view, a jagged, rusted outline against the suffocating dark. Thomas's chest burned, every muscle in his body screaming in protest as he forced himself forward. Just a little farther, just a few more steps. The whispers returned, soft at first but growing louder with every inch he gained. "Don't leave us." He skidded to a halt at the gates, his hands flying to the iron bars. They were ice cold beneath his palms, their rust flaking into his skin. Thomas pulled, but the gate didn't budge. It was stuck, welded shut by age and disuse. He screamed in frustration, shaking the bars with every ounce of strength he had left. Behind him, the whispers grew closer, more desperate, their voices melting into screams. "You can't leave." Thomas turned, his back pressed to the gate. The mist had coalesced into a solid wall, and from it, the figures emerged. Dozens of them now, their bodies jerking unnaturally as they closed the distance. Their hollow eyes were fixed on him, and their mouths moved in silent unison, their words impossible to hear, but heavy with intent. Then one figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, its form more solid. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Thomas felt its gaze like a weight on his chest. It raised one skeletal hand, pointing at him. "You were chosen." The words rang in his head like a bell, loud and final, reverberating through his very being. Before he could react, the earth trembled once more, and then the ground beneath him collapsed. The world fell apart as the ground beneath Thomas gave way, collapsing like a fragile crust into a void he could not see. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever known. Gravity twisted violently, as if the very rules of physics had been rewritten in those fleeting, chaotic seconds. His body tumbled, limbs flailing uselessly as he plunged downward, swallowed whole by the earth. The blackness was absolute, more suffocating than the deepest cave, a darkness that pressed against his skin like it had weight. It felt alive, hot and cold at the same time, as though the air itself churned around him in some unholy, unseen maelstrom. And then, suddenly, he stopped. The landing was brutal. Thomas struck something solid, a bone-jarring collision that sent sharp pain splintering through his back and shoulders. He gasped, air forcing itself into his lungs in ragged, desperate gulps. The shock of the impact reverberated through every joint, leaving him sprawled on his side, stunned and disoriented. It took him a moment to realize that the surface beneath him wasn't hard like stone or wood. It was soft, yielding, yet textured with an unnatural give, as though he were lying atop rotting meat or flesh left too long in the sun. His stomach heaved as he pushed himself up on shaking arms, nausea surging as his fingers sank slightly into the surface. There was a faint squelch, wet and sickening. Thomas froze, his heart thudding painfully as he turned his head, straining to see in the oppressive darkness. The air was different down here, thicker, humid and stinking of decay so strong it burned his sinuses with every shallow breath. It was a smell beyond death, something older, fouler, as though whatever lay beneath this cemetery had been fermenting for centuries in secret. The darkness remained unbroken, stretching endlessly in all directions. His throat tightened with panic, but when he reached for his flashlight, he realized it was gone, lost in the fall or swallowed by whatever this place was. "Hello?" he croaked, though the sound barely escaped his lips, swallowed whole by the oppressive void. Even his voice felt small, insignificant here. like he had entered a place where human existence was little more than an afterthought. Something shifted in the dark. It wasn't a sound he heard exactly, but rather one he felt. A vibration ran through the ground beneath him, deep and slow, like something impossibly massive moving far below the surface. The sensation rippled through his arms and chest, a pulsing rhythm that made his teeth ache and his vision blur for a second. He scrambled to his feet, his boots slipping against the slick, fleshy ground, his pulse racing as the vibrations stopped as suddenly as they'd begun. Silence descended once more, heavier now, dense with the unbearable weight of anticipation. Where am I?" he muttered, his voice trembling. He took a cautious step forward, each movement accompanied by the wet slap of his boots against the surface. The sound seemed too loud, echoing faintly into the void. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, to shrink into the silence. But the thought of remaining in this suffocating blackness was somehow worse. As he walked, the air grew warmer, the stench intensifying with every step. It clung to him, soaking into his clothes and hair, until he felt it sinking into his very pores. And then out of the darkness there came a sound. It started as a low hum, so faint that he thought at first it might be his imagination. But the longer he listened, the clearer it became, an undulating, vibrating tone that shifted in pitch, almost musical. The sound felt wrong in his ears, like a song played backward, or a language not meant for human comprehension. Thomas staggered, clutching at his head as the hum swelled, growing louder and louder until it seemed to fill every crevice of his mind. "Stop. Please stop," he whispered, but the sound only grew stronger, burrowing deeper. It was inside him now, behind his eyes, pulsing in his chest like a second heartbeat, and then he saw it. A faint light flickered in the distance, dim and red, as though shining through blood-soaked cloth. Thomas froze, his body refusing to move, though his mind screamed at him to run. The light pulsed, in time with the throbbing vibration, and though it was far away, it felt aware. It was watching him. A primal terror surged through him as he realized that whatever waited in the dark beyond that light knew he was there. It had been waiting for him, calling to him. The hum stopped. For one breathless moment, there was only silence again. And then, a voice. Thomas. The sound of his name, spoken in a voice he didn't recognize, tore through him like a knife. It was deep, layered, as though spoken by 1,000 mouths at once. It came from all around him, vibrating through the ground and air, resonating inside his chest. Thomas whipped around, spinning wildly as he tried to find the source, his vision swimming with panic. But there was nothing. "Thomas." The voice came again, closer this time, right behind him. He turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he swore he saw movement in the corner of his vision. A shape, a towering, shifting silhouette just at the edge of the red glow. It moved like smoke, formless and yet purposeful, tendrils of shadow curling outward as it advanced toward him. "Stay away," he shouted, his voice cracking, but the figure only drew nearer. The red glow intensified, spilling across the fleshy ground like blood seeping through cloth. Thomas stumbled backward, slipping and falling hard. Pain shot up his spine, but he barely noticed it as the shadow loomed over him, a presence so massive it seemed to block out the air itself. The figure stopped, hovering just inches away. Thomas couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but he could feel it staring at him. It radiated a cold, overwhelming malice, a hatred so pure it made the marrow in his bones ache. "You were chosen," the voice whispered again, softer now, like a lover's murmur. "For the secrets of the earth must be fed." The ground beneath Thomas trembled once more, and with it came a new sound, the wet, hungry gurgle of something awakening far below. A deep rumble rose from the darkness, accompanied by a noise like flesh tearing apart. And then, Thomas screamed as the earth opened again. The earth trembled again, violently this time, and Thomas was thrust into the air, weightless for a moment, before gravity yanked him back down. His body slammed against the ground, and for a brief second, everything was silent. His breath was stolen from him, suffocated by the weight of his panic, his chest heaving as if trying to escape the crushing atmosphere that surrounded him. Pain blossomed in his ribs, a dull throb that only seemed to grow sharper with each beat of his heart. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the feeling that he was being watched, that invisible eyes were searing through the layers of darkness, drilling into him from all sides. Every fiber of his being screamed to run, but his legs refused to move, frozen in place by something far more sinister than mere fear. The ground beneath him was no longer the slick, fleshy mass it had once been. It had turned alive. The surface shifted under his body as if responding to his touch, writhing with unnatural, wet movements that made his stomach churn. There was something about the texture of the earth now, something off, as if it were breathing, pulsing in time with the sinister hum that had begun to vibrate through the air again. His senses were assaulted from all angles. The air felt thick, heavy, each inhalation like breathing through wet cloth. The scent was overpowering, rotting meat mixed with the smell of decay, the rank stench of burial and forgotten years. His mind spun with an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia, as though the walls of this place were closing in on him, slowly, steadily, a relentless pressure that grew heavier with every passing second. And then, through the suffocating darkness, the voice came again. Thomas. The sound was no longer just a whisper. It was a physical force, something that reverberated through his very bones, a vibration that rattled his teeth and clawed at his insides. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around him, inside his mind, invading his very thoughts. He couldn't escape it, couldn't escape the utter knowingness of it. The voice felt ancient, older than anything he had ever encountered. It was a voice that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of time and space, as though it existed in all places at once. His breath caught, a choked gasp escaping him as he twisted his body, looking around in desperation. But there was nothing, no figure, no shape, only the darkness that pressed in on him, impenetrable and suffocating. And yet, he knew, he could feel the presence of something just out of sight. Something terrible and vast. It was moving closer, its intentions dark and unfathomable. The air grew colder still, and Thomas's breath became visible, puffing in small, ragged clouds before him. The cold was not just physical. It was something deeper, colder than any temperature he had ever felt. It reached into his soul, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, an instinctive warning flaring within him, but his mind refused to understand the source of the danger. Another tremor rocked the ground beneath him, and this time, it didn't stop. It rolled through the earth like a wave, slowly at first, but gaining momentum with every passing second. The ground split open with a low, bone-rattling crack, and from the gap, a thin, gnarled hand reached up, a hand that seemed to form out of the very soil, pulling itself from the blackened earth as though the dirt itself was giving birth to it. The fingers were twisted, elongated, the skin drawn taut over knuckles that jutted out at unnatural angles. The hand flexed, its claws scraping against the soil as it stretched upward, seeking something. Or someone. Thomas's eyes widened in horror as he saw it. More of them. From the fissure in the ground, countless hands emerged, skeletal and mangled, their fingers clawing toward him with an almost hungry intent. It was as if the earth had become a tomb, and it was alive. Every inch of the ground seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its own grotesque heartbeat. The dirt shifted again, pulling itself apart, and from the cracks emerged figures. More and more, their forms coalescing from the shadows, twisted shapes that blurred in and out of focus like reflections in a shattered mirror. Thomas's heart raced as the figures took shape, their bodies ghastly imitations of life. Some were whole, their features contorted in eternal screams, their eyes wide with terror. Others were mere fragments, pieces of decayed flesh and bone that seemed to hover in place, suspended in the air by a will of their own. Their mouths were open, but they did not speak. Instead, they emitted an inhuman sound, a low, guttural moan that reverberated through the earth, rising in pitch until it became a cacophony of shrieks. The sound tore at his nerves, slicing through his mind like jagged glass. Thomas stumbled backward, his legs giving way beneath him as the figures continued to emerge from the earth. They circled him now, their presence oppressive, suffocating. There was nowhere to run, no escape. The walls of darkness seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, the air thickening as if the very weight of the place was crushing him. He could feel them watching him, their eyes locked onto him with an intensity that was both suffocating and unnerving. Their hollow gazes pierced him, each one a judgment, an accusation, as if they knew everything about him. His fears, his guilt, his failures, they were waiting. A cold, sickening realization began to settle in Thomas's chest. These were not just figures, they were souls, lost souls, trapped here in this forgotten place, forever bound to the earth, their suffering eternal. And now, they had found him. One figure reached out, its fingers elongated and trembling, and touched his arm. The contact was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. A frigid, ice-cold grip that sank deep into his flesh, piercing to the bone. Thomas cried out. A scream caught in his throat as the touch sent waves of agonizing cold through him. The figure's touch burned like frostbite, spreading outward from his arm, until it felt as though his entire body was being consumed by an icy fire. The whisper returned. Soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as the figure leaned closer. You were chosen. The words were so soft, so laden with malice, that they seemed to echo in his mind, repeating over and over, each time growing more forceful. The hands closed in, circling him, pulling him inward, as though drawing him into their eternal suffering. The ground beneath him began to rumble once more, and Thomas felt the earth itself beginning to rise. He was no longer standing on solid ground, but on something that was moving, undulating, as though the earth was alive, breathing beneath him. The space around him began to close in, the darkness pressing tighter and tighter, until it felt as if there was no escape, nowhere to hide. He was trapped in the heart of it all, caught between the suffocating weight of the earth and the endless gaze of those who had been forgotten. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered one last time, and with it came the sharp, unmistakable feeling of doom. And then, Thomas's vision blurred. The world collapsed inward, and the darkness consumed him entirely. When Thomas's eyes opened again, he wasn't sure if he was still alive. The world around him had shifted, twisted into something so foreign, so alien, that it no longer resembled the reality he had known. The oppressive darkness that had suffocated him moments before was gone, replaced by a dull, sickly gray fog that seemed to suffuse everything, choking the air and dulling the edges of every shadow. The ground beneath him was no longer the writhing, living mass it had once been. Instead, it had become solid, cold, and unyielding, a stark contrast to the fleshy, pulsing terrain he had felt earlier. But it was no less unsettling. The air was still thick, hanging like a heavy veil, and every breath felt like inhaling the dust of forgotten years. He lay still for a long moment, trying to understand his surroundings. His limbs were stiff, like they had been locked in place for too long. He was still on the ground, though it wasn't the soft, breathing earth he had fallen onto. His back was pressed against something hard, slick with moisture, yet there was no sound, no movement. The oppressive silence weighed on him like a physical force. Thomas slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, his head spinning as he tried to collect his thoughts. His body felt heavy, as though he were being pulled back into the earth itself, weighed down by some unseen force. His fingers brushed against his face, his skin cold and clammy, and as he felt the surface of his cheek, he realized there was something wet there. He pulled his hand back, his heart leaping in his chest as he saw the blood staining his fingers. The blood wasn't his. Panic surged through him, raw and unrelenting. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a deafening drum in his ears. His breaths came faster, shallower, as his eyes darted around the foggy expanse. He felt the sudden, overwhelming sensation of being surrounded. as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on him. The fog had thickened, its edges curling around him like the tendrils of a living creature, creeping and shifting in a slow, methodical dance. It was alive. He could feel it. The very air seemed to be alive, its weight pushing down on him, suffocating him as he tried to make sense of what was happening. And then came the sound, a low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was sighing in pain. It started far away, a distant rumble that vibrated through the ground, but it grew louder, closer, until it reverberated in Thomas's chest, shaking him to his core. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't something that could be explained by any earthly force. It was a voice, though not one that he could understand. It wasn't human. It was as though the very essence of the land was speaking, its words curling around him like tendrils of smoke, suffocating him from the inside out. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat as the sound grew louder, closer still. It was a deep, rasping sound, like the scraping of ancient bones against stone, dragging and pulling at the air, leaving behind a cold, unsettling chill in its wake. His pulse quickened. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, trembling as though something vast, something ancient was stirring beneath the surface. "It's not real," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling, though he didn't believe it. Nothing here felt real. This place, this thing he had stumbled into, it wasn't like anything he could comprehend. The air tasted wrong, the ground beneath him felt wrong, and the presence that hovered in the fog around him was undeniable. He wasn't alone. The fog thickened once more, swirling around him with greater intensity, and Thomas could barely see his own hand in front of his face. He felt it, something, moving in the dense mist. The sense of being watched returned, stronger now, suffocating in its intensity. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but his legs refused to cooperate, frozen in place by the weight of fear and uncertainty. His heart pounded louder, thundering in his ears. He could feel the presence closing in, something vast and monstrous, crawling toward him from the fog. It was a feeling unlike any he had ever experienced. No longer just fear, but something much deeper, a sense of dread. Not the fear of being hurt, but the fear of knowing something far worse was about to unfold. And then, just as he thought he might break under the pressure, the sound returned, a high-pitched, almost mechanical squeal that made his skin crawl. The fog parted momentarily, and in that brief moment of clarity, he saw it. The figure was massive, towering, reaching far above him, its form a twisted mass of shadow and flesh. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, stretching out in all directions like broken tree branches. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was nothing but a void, a gaping maw of blackness. There was no expression, no discernible features, just an empty, insatiable hunger that seemed to stretch on forever. The emptiness inside it was suffocating. It was a void that seemed to consume everything in its path, drawing in the very air, the very light, until nothing was left but darkness. Its presence was not physical, it was something beyond the material world, a thing that existed in the space between spaces, outside of time, outside of reality. Thomas's breath caught in his throat, his vision swimming as the creature drew closer. The fog seemed to retreat, parting as the figure advanced, leaving behind a trail of icy cold in its wake. The world around him began to twist, warping and distorting as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The ground under him trembled, shaking as if the world was coming apart at the seams. The creature's form loomed closer, its shape shifting in and out of the fog, its presence becoming more real, more tangible with each passing second. Thomas's eyes widened in horror as the figure's shadow grew longer, stretching out across the ground, darkening everything in its wake. He could feel it. It knew him. It was coming for him. It had always been coming for him. The weight of inevitability pressed down on him, suffocating him, as though the creature had always been a part of him, waiting to be called forth. And then, just as the creature reached out toward him with its elongated skeletal fingers, Thomas screamed, his mind unraveling under the pressure of the terror he felt. He felt the ground fall away beneath him once more, but this time there was no hope, no escape, only the waiting darkness. The world around Thomas began to distort, twisting, pulling apart at the seams like an old, tattered painting. His surroundings, once vague and unreachable, were now closing in on him with a terrifying sense of familiarity. He could feel it. The air had shifted, thickened, its temperature plummeting to an unnatural cold that sank deep into his bones. It was as if the fog itself had turned into something else, something sentient, something alive, and it was reaching out to touch him, to pull him into its suffocating embrace. For a long moment there was only silence. The heavy, suffocating quiet stretched on, an oppressive force that seemed to claw at his very mind, trying to break through his thoughts. His heart pounded painfully in his chest, his breath shallow and erratic as he attempted to steady himself. It wasn't the physical cold that was disturbing him. It was the crushing weight of something else, a presence, something ancient and malevolent, closing in on him, wrapping him in a web of dread so thick he could feel it pressing against his skin, suffocating him with its unrelenting pressure. The fog curled around him, seeping into every corner of his mind, the tendrils of darkness pulling him deeper into its maze. Every movement, every breath felt like a betrayal. The air was so thick with malevolence, it seemed to solidify around him. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead, as though the earth beneath him was holding him in place, preventing him from escaping the darkness that surrounded him. There was no exit, no way out. And worse yet, no way to explain what he was feeling. The world seemed to be collapsing in on itself, the boundaries of space and time blurring as the ground beneath his feet began to tremble once more. This time, the tremors weren't just physical, they were deeper, more visceral. They vibrated through his bones, shaking him to the core. He could feel it, in his very soul, the tremor of something vast, something ancient, stirring beneath him. The sound of shifting earth, of cracking stone echoed in the distance, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his bones. It was a deep, inhuman sound, like the groan of some unfathomable beast awakening from a long slumber, its hunger insatiable. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as his gaze snapped around in panic. He could see nothing, only the fog, the swirling mist that seemed to come alive, curling around him like the breath of 1,000 forgotten nightmares. But he could feel them, the eyes, the watching eyes. They were there, somewhere in the mist, watching him, studying him, waiting for him to make a move. His body tensed, muscles locked in a fight-or-flight response, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The fog was a prison, and he was its prisoner. A whisper, no, a hiss, slithered into his ear, a sound so faint, so subtle that at first he wasn't sure if it had been real. But then it came again, louder this time, an almost hungry hiss that seemed to scrape against his mind, slipping between his thoughts like a knife. He spun around, his head jerking in every direction, but still, there was nothing except the suffocating fog. And yet, he could feel it now. The presence was closer. It was near him, circling him like a predator, its breath hot and rancid on the back of his neck, its fingers reaching out to graze his skin with a coldness that made him want to scream. The air seemed to press in on him from all sides, thick and suffocating, as though the fog itself had become a living thing, squeezing him in its grasp. His heart hammered in his chest, his body trembling uncontrollably as the silence around him became deafening, unbearable. He could feel it. Something was changing. The world around him wasn't just darkening, it was deteriorating, unraveling at the edges like the fraying fabric of a nightmare that had begun to consume him whole. The fog seemed to grow thicker, more substantial, taking on a weight that felt like an invisible hand pressing against his chest. "You can't escape." The voice rasped again, this time from somewhere beneath him, deep in the earth. The voice was not human, not anything from this world. It was an echo from another time, from a place where no mortal soul should ever tread. The words crawled under his skin, burrowing deep into his mind, filling him with an ice-cold dread that seemed to seep into every corner of his being. The presence was so strong, so oppressive, that it felt as though the very ground beneath him was alive with it. Each pulse of the earth sending waves of nausea through him, each tremor making him feel as though he were being dragged deeper into the void. And then there was a sound, a crackling like dry leaves rustling in the dead of night. It was followed by the unmistakable snap of something breaking, shattering. The air around him seemed to distort, bending and twisting in unnatural ways as a shadow began to emerge from the fog. It was a mass, no, a shape. Something vast, shifting and amorphous. It moved with a purpose, its form constantly changing, ever shifting, as though it could not decide what it was. The edges of its body were blurry, like a smudge of ink on a wet page. The more Thomas stared at it, the more it moved, as if the very act of looking at it made it live, made it grow. The shape loomed closer, its movements slow but deliberate, like the steady advance of some ancient beast, a creature that had long ago abandoned the notion of mercy. Then, the creature let out a sound. A noise so guttural, so filled with agony and rage, that it felt as though the air itself had been torn apart by the sheer force of it. It was a sound that ripped through Thomas's mind, reverberating deep within his soul. He felt it, the raw, primal terror of something so ancient, so powerful, that it made everything else in the world seem meaningless, insignificant. The creature's form flickered once more, and in that fleeting moment, Thomas saw it clearly. It was a face, a visage twisted beyond recognition, stretched in agonized torment, its features nothing but contorted masses of dark shadows and bone. There were eyes, but they were not eyes, just empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare into the very fabric of his mind. There was no sense of self in those eyes, no humanity, only an endless, insatiable hunger that threatened to swallow him whole. The fog around him grew darker, denser, pressing in closer. The air felt sick, as though it were being poisoned by the very presence of the creature, suffocating the life from everything around it. Thomas's vision blurred, his body trembling violently with a combination of fear and cold. His legs buckled beneath him, and he fell to the ground, his hand scraping across the wet, slick surface of what he could only assume was stone. His fingers slid through the wetness, and when he pulled them back, they were coated in a viscous, sticky substance, a deep, almost black liquid that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He could feel it now, the pull. Something inside him was changing, bending under the weight of this malevolent presence. The air itself seemed to be thickening, a suffocating blanket that slowly smothered him. The ground beneath him began to tremble once again, the rumbling intensifying as the fog began to close in, the mist swirling around him like a living creature, its tendrils wrapping tighter, suffocating him from every side. There was no escape, no way out. And as the shadow loomed closer, Thomas realized with a sinking heart that he had never truly been alone. The creature was not just a force of nature, it was a part of him, a reflection of the darkness that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to consume him. It was too late to run now. Thomas's thoughts shattered like glass, scattering in 1,000 different directions, each piece as sharp and jagged as the terror crawling through his veins. His mind had become a battlefield, a war zone where reality itself was being ripped apart by invisible forces. The fog, thick and suffocating, was no longer just a physical presence. It had morphed into something far more dangerous, something intangible, a manifestation of the very nightmare that had haunted him from the moment he stepped foot in this forsaken place. He could feel it pressing in on him, thickening with each passing second, wrapping itself around his thoughts, clinging to his skin like a second suffocating layer. The air tasted like decay, like rot, like the very essence of death itself had seeped into the atmosphere. His breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one more difficult than the last, as though the very air were being drained from his lungs, replaced by the fetid stench of something far darker. His body trembled uncontrollably, his limbs heavy with a dread so profound that it felt as if his very soul was being crushed by the weight of it. But there was no escape. He knew that now. There was nowhere to go. The ground had become a prison, the fog an inescapable cage, and the creature, it was always there, lurking, watching. Its presence so oppressive that it seemed to permeate every corner of his mind. The creature's form flickered in and out of his vision, a shifting mass of shadow and malice, something so vast and incomprehensible that it defied all logic. He could see the edges of it, the outline of its body, but every time he tried to focus, it slipped away, dissolving into the mist, as though it existed in some other dimension, just beyond the reach of his understanding. Its very absence was terrifying. There was no sound, no movement, just the presence, always the presence, that tugged at the corners of his mind, sending a cold shiver down his spine. It wasn't just watching him. It was inside him, worming its way into his thoughts, consuming his sanity piece by piece. The ground beneath him was no longer solid. It had become a living thing, a pulsing, shifting mass that seemed to breathe in time with his own heartbeat. He could feel the vibrations deep in his bones, like the distant growl of some ancient beast stirring from its slumber. The fog thickened, swirling around him in waves, choking him with its cold, clammy fingers. He stumbled, his feet sinking into the soft earth beneath him, as though the ground itself were trying to swallow him whole. The weight of the fog pressed against him, suffocating him with its relentless grip, while the air itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. In the distance, a low, eerie hum began to reverberate through the mist, a sound so faint at first that it was almost imperceptible. But then it grew louder, vibrating through the very air, sending a ripple of terror through his chest. It wasn't a natural sound. It was a hum of wrongness, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth, like the heartbeat of some ancient, slumbering thing that had been disturbed. The noise was hypnotic, pulling at the edges of his mind, luring him toward it like a moth to a flame. He could feel it, feel the pull, the compulsion to move toward it, as though the sound itself was calling to him, urging him to come closer, to surrender. But Thomas fought it. He fought with every ounce of strength he had left. His body screamed in protest, his legs trembling beneath him, his mind teetering on the edge of insanity. The creature was near. He could feel it. No, it wasn't near. It was all around him, woven into the very fabric of the world. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though the fog itself were tightening around his chest, squeezing the very life from him. His vision blurred, the edges of his sight distorting as the mist seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching and warping like something alive. The humming grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through his bones, shaking his very soul. It was coming from all directions, surrounding him, suffocating him, and yet as he spun in circles, desperate to escape it, he couldn't pinpoint its source. There was no center to the sound, no beginning or end. It was as though it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. His mind was spiraling into chaos, each breath an agony, each second stretching into eternity. His hands reached out blindly, grasping for something, anything, that could anchor him to reality. But there was nothing. The fog had consumed everything, and then the ground beneath him buckled. Thomas gasped in horror as the earth cracked open beneath his feet. A deep, guttural rumble shook the very air around him, vibrating through his chest, filling his entire body with an unbearable pressure. The crack in the ground widened, the jagged edges of broken earth reaching up like skeletal fingers, clawing at the air as though desperate to tear the world apart. The mist poured into the chasm, swirling and swirling, thickening, condensing into something far darker. The smell was overpowering now, a stench of rot, of decay, of something far older and far more terrible than death itself. And from the depths of the earth, something rose. Thomas's heart stopped. A shape, no, forms, began to emerge from the darkness, first as vague silhouettes, like shadows given form, and then more distinct as they climbed from the crack in the earth. He could hear them now. The whispering, low and guttural, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, a chorus of forgotten souls. their words unintelligible, yet filled with a terrible hunger. They were figures, humanoid in shape, but grotesque and malformed. Their bodies covered in twisted, writhing tendrils, their faces distorted beyond recognition. Their eyes, those eyes, were the most horrifying thing of all. Hollow, empty sockets that stared into his soul with an intensity that burned him from within. They didn't move like humans. They glided, floating just above the earth, their limbs twitching unnaturally as they drifted toward him, their faces blank, their gazes fixed and unwavering. Their mouths were open, but there was no sound, only the hum. The humming grew louder as though it were coming from their very bodies, from the space between them, from the air itself. The world seemed to pulse with the noise, an insistent, deafening sound that filled his head and made his teeth ache. He could feel their gaze, cold and unforgiving, penetrating deep into his mind, into his very being. And then, as if on cue, they began to move, closer, always closer. Thomas's body froze. There was no way out. There was no escape. The darkness was closing in, the creatures emerging from the earth like a tide of death. And the humming, it was inside his head now, inside his thoughts, eating away at his sanity. He could feel it, like 1,000 whispers scratching at his mind, clawing at his thoughts, dragging him into the abyss. His body refused to move, locked in place by the sheer weight of the horror surrounding him. As the figures drew near, he could almost feel their cold breath, could almost taste the rot on the air. The ground was no longer solid. It was soft, spongy, as though it were alive, breathing in sync with the mist, with the creatures, with everything. And then, in the moment just before he thought he would lose his mind entirely, he heard something else. A voice, familiar, dark, haunting. It whispered his name, and in that whisper, Thomas knew he was already lost. Thomas felt the air change again. The shift was subtle at first, like a breath taken just a little too sharply. But soon the pressure grew unbearable, pressing against his skin like the weight of 1,000 invisible hands. His eyes flickered nervously to the edges of the fog, his mind screaming for answers, yet every instinct told him not to seek them. There was something here, something far older and darker than he could ever comprehend. Something that had existed long before his arrival and would likely outlive him in ways he didn't want to imagine. The ground beneath him still pulsed, alive with the terror of an ancient thing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, this presence, had been waiting for every step he took, seemed to pull him deeper into the fog, pulling him away from the world he knew, plunging him into something foreign, something that did not want him here. His breathing became. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the walls of this forgotten cemetery, the stones cold to the touch, each one marked with symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift in the dim light, as though the gravestones themselves were alive, their surfaces alive with memory and malice. He could feel the eyes of the dead watching him from their resting places, their hollow gazes boring into his very soul, sending waves of cold dread crashing through his chest. Each stone seemed to carry a secret, a curse, and Thomas knew deep in his gut that the longer he stayed in this cursed place, the more those secrets would begin to claw at his own sanity. The wind, now a distant, mournful whisper, began to pick up, its moan echoing through the fog, carrying with it a sound that Thomas couldn't quite place. It was almost like voices, low and guttural, murmuring his name, whispering it over and over again. He stopped, heart racing, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. It was impossible to discern the words, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. They were here. They were always here. He had known it, felt it, even before he had come to this forsaken cemetery. But now, it was unbearable. The air around him seemed to thicken, the very particles of the fog itself turning into an oppressive force, tugging at him from all sides, suffocating him in its embrace. He reached out, desperate to steady himself, and his fingers grazed one of the gravestones. It was as cold as ice, colder than anything he had ever touched before, sending a jolt of fear through him that almost took his breath away. The stone was slick with moisture, but not just from the fog. No, this felt different. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too unnatural, as though it had been soaked in something far darker than mere water. And then it happened. A sharp, piercing sound, like the cracking of bone, ripped through the air, and the ground beneath Thomas's feet shifted again, this time with a sudden, violent force that sent him sprawling to the earth. He hit the ground hard, his body slamming against the dirt with a sickening thud. Pain shot through him, but it was distant. Distant compared to the sensation of something watching him from all sides, something ancient and hungry. Thomas barely had time to react before the air around him seemed to thicken, constricting around his chest as though the fog itself were tightening, suffocating him. The low murmurs of the voices grew louder, louder still, until they filled his head, echoing like a cacophony of maddening whispers. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else, until all he could hear were those voices, those cursed, ghostly whispers calling his name. They were closing in on him. He struggled to push himself up, but the ground seemed to shift beneath him, like quicksand, pulling him deeper into the earth, holding him in place. It was impossible to move, impossible to break free. It was as though the land itself had claimed him, as though the cemetery had decided that it would not let him leave, not alive. His breath quickened, his vision blurring as panic surged through him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, the fog parted for the briefest of moments, and through the shifting mists, Thomas saw it. It was not one figure. It was many, a procession of figures, their forms shrouded in tattered, blackened robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved in perfect synchrony, gliding across the cemetery like shadows brought to life, their steps soundless, as if they were floating just above the earth. There was no light to cast shadows, no moon to reveal their forms, yet Thomas could feel their presence, feel the weight of their eyes upon him, even though he could not see their faces. The air grew colder still, and with it, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, curling around his feet like tendrils of dark energy. His skin crawled, his bones ached, the whispers intensified, and Thomas could feel them, inside his head, like 1,000 knives scraping across the fragile membrane of his mind. Then, as if on cue, the figures turned toward him. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and as they did, Thomas felt a surge of terror like he had never known. They were not just specters, they were not mere ghosts. No, these were something far worse. Creatures that lived beyond death, beyond anything human, and they had come for him. The leader, a figure taller than the rest, took a step forward, its form shrouded in shadow, and for the briefest moment, Thomas thought he saw its face. A face that was not truly a face at all, but a mass of twisted, shifting features, a void where the eyes should have been, and a mouth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. It opened, and from it came a sound, a screech, low and guttural, that tore through Thomas's mind like a jagged blade. He could no longer tell where the fog ended and the figures began. His surroundings seemed to dissolve into a swirling vortex of shadows and whispers, pulling him deeper into the grip of whatever dark force controlled this place. The ground beneath him shook again, this time with greater intensity. The cemetery, this forsaken graveyard, was not merely a place of burial. It was a nexus, a gateway to something far darker than Thomas had ever imagined, and it was now clear that he had become part of it. His pulse raced, his mind raced, but there was nowhere to run. In the midst of the growing panic, something in Thomas's mind broke, and the darkness closed in. Thomas's breath hitched, his pulse thudding like a drumbeat in his ears, every thrum a reminder that he was still alive, still trapped in the hellish grip of this forsaken cemetery. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his feet seemingly sinking into the very earth itself, the ground hungry, eager to pull him deeper into its suffocating embrace. The fog, thick and impenetrable, clung to him like a shroud, blurring the world into twisted shapes and shadows that danced and flickered just beyond the edge of his vision. But it wasn't the fog that terrified him now. No, it was the growing sense that the cemetery itself had begun to close in on him, its boundaries shifting, changing, as though it were alive, a sentient being that could feel his fear and was feeding on it. As he moved further into the graveyard, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every passing second. It wasn't just the cold, it was something deeper, something more visceral. The air felt wrong, unnatural, like it was charged with an energy that shouldn't exist, a malignant force pressing down on him, filling his lungs with something heavier than oxygen, something toxic. His throat burned, as though he were breathing in smoke, but there was no fire. There was no escape from this suffocating, invisible force. It was as if the very atmosphere was pulling him down, forcing him into the depths of some ancient abyss. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but it was more than that. He could feel them, the dead, those whose names were lost to time, their forgotten souls lingering here, trapped in the fog, forever waiting. He stumbled, his legs weak, trembling with the strain of pushing against the invisible weight of the air. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking. Minutes, hours, days. Time had become irrelevant, warped and twisted by the malign presence that seemed to seep into everything, twisting reality until it was nothing more than a sickening dream. His mind was fraying at the edges, the terror slowly unspooling everything he had once known, and he found himself grappling with a maddening sense of isolation. This was no ordinary cemetery. This place was a prison, a labyrinth of forgotten souls, a tomb for the cursed, and it was far from empty. The whispering voices, low and guttural, had grown louder, more insistent. They weren't just murmurs anymore. No, now they were distinct, each voice laced with malice, with a hunger that chilled Thomas to the bone. They spoke in languages he could not understand, their words dripping with a venomous desire to claim him. He could feel them circling him, drawing closer with each step, invisible hands brushing against his skin, their icy fingers grazing his neck, sending shockwaves of terror down his spine. The feeling of being watched, no, hunted, was overwhelming, the sense that they were right there, just beyond the veil of mist, lurking, waiting. There was no escape. And then, as though to punctuate this unbearable tension, a figure emerged from the fog. A shape, indistinct at first, but slowly taking form, its outline coalescing into something wrong. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the figure, but his recognition brought no comfort. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a woman, it was something else entirely. The creature before him was tall, impossibly thin, its form obscured by a cloak that seemed to flicker with a life of its own, undulating like the surface of a dark lake. Its face was a mask of darkness, a void where eyes should have been, and its mouth hung open, wide and empty, like a gaping maw ready to devour everything in its path. The figure was not standing. It hovered, drifting effortlessly just above the ground, and as it moved, it left behind an almost tangible trail of cold that spread like a plague, infecting everything it touched. Thomas couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The very air around him seemed to freeze, the temperature dropping to unbearable lows, as though the presence of this entity had sucked the warmth from the world. His chest tightened, the invisible weight pressing harder, threatening to crush him under the force of its unseen hands. But it wasn't the cold that terrified him the most. No, it was the voice. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. There were no words. There was no sound. Instead, it was a sensation, a presence, a force that spoke directly to his mind, bypassing the need for speech altogether. It filled his thoughts with images. Images of death, of decay, of souls trapped for eternity, their anguish echoing in the blackness. Thomas could feel it, feel the endless crushing weight of the grave, a weight that sought to pull him into its depths, to drown him in the sorrow and rage of those who had died before him. It wasn't just the physical terror. It was the realization that he wasn't just in a cemetery. He was in a realm, a twisted, cursed world that existed beyond death itself. A place where the dead roamed freely, bound to this land by some unholy force, feeding on the living. And now, Thomas had become part of it. His legs buckled and he collapsed to the ground, his body shaking with terror. But even as he fell, even as his mind screamed for release, he could feel the creature's presence closing in, its malice so palpable that it seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. Every movement, every breath, every second he spent here was one step closer to being consumed. He could feel it in his bones, this terrible knowledge, that there was no escape. This was where he would die, not just physically, but spiritually. His soul lost forever in the void that stretched out before him. As his vision blurred, his mind began to unravel. The whispers became screams, high-pitched, shrill, like nails on a chalkboard. The figures in the fog were no longer just shadows. They were real, solid, their forms twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes that defied logic and reason. Their faces were masks of agony, their bodies rotting, decaying before his eyes. Some crawled on all fours, dragging themselves through the fog, their limbs broken, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. Others floated, their hands reaching out for him, their fingers elongated and sharp, like the claws of some monstrous creature. Their voices joined the creatures, and the cacophony was unbearable, a chorus of madness that threatened to shatter his sanity. He tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came. His throat was dry, parched as though it had been carved open by the very air. His vision dimmed, his consciousness slipping away into the abyss. The last thing he saw before he succumbed to the darkness was the face of the creature, its empty, hollow eyes staring into his soul, and in that moment, Thomas knew the truth. He was already dead. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next horrifying story. Now tell me, if you heard your name whispered in the dark, would you look back or would you run?